The phone call came at 6:30 in the morning. William was already awake, preparing for another day of royal duties when his private secretary's voice cut through the quiet of their Kensington Palace apartment. The words hit him like a physical blow, and Kate watched her husband's face drain of color as he gripped the phone tighter. "When?" was all William managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Kate moved closer, instinctively reaching for his free hand. She had seen that look before, during the darkest moments of their marriage when the weight of duty seemed too heavy to bear. But this was different. This was the look of a man who had just lost someone irreplaceable. The news would soon spread, across the nation like wildfire, but for now in the privacy of their bedroom it belonged only to them. Queen Elizabeth II had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. At 96 years old, she had lived longer than any monarch in British history, but that knowledge did little to soften the blow. She was not just the Queen to William. She was his beloved grandmother, the woman who had guided him through the most challenging moments of his life. Kate had never seen her husband cry, not even at their wedding when emotion overwhelmed so many others, but now, tears traced silent paths down his cheeks as he ended the call and turned to face her. She didn't need to ask what had happened. The gravity of the moment was written in every line of his face, in the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight that had suddenly doubled. "She's gone," he said simply. And Kate felt her own heart break, not just for the loss of a remarkable woman, but for the pain she saw in the man she loved. Outside their windows, London was beginning to wake up. Commuters were making their way to work, children were getting ready for school, and life was continuing its normal rhythm, completely unaware that everything had just changed. Soon, the news would reach every corner of the United Kingdom and beyond. But for these precious few minutes, William and Kate existed in a bubble of private grief. Kate had always admired the Queen's strength, her unwavering dedication to duty, and her remarkable ability to remain composed under any circumstances. During their early days as a married couple, Elizabeth had taken Kate under her wing, offering gentle guidance on navigating the complex world of royal protocol, while never making her feel inadequate or overwhelmed. The Queen had a way of making everyone feel special, whether they were world leaders or stable hands at Balmoral. William sat heavily on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands. Kate knew he was thinking about their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how to explain to them that their great-grandmother, who had taught them to fish at Balmoral and always had sweets hidden in her handbag during family gatherings, would never be coming home again. The practical side of Kate's mind began working through what needed to happen next. There would be phone calls to make, arrangements to coordinate, and a grieving nation to help lead through this unprecedented moment. But the mother and wife in her knew that all of that could wait. Right now, her family needed her strength. She sat beside William on the bed and took his hand in both of hers. They had weathered many storms together, from the intense media scrutiny of their courtship to the challenges of raising children in the public eye. But this felt different, more profound. This was not just personal grief. It was the end of an era that had defined Britain for 70 years. "The children," William finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "How do we tell them?" Kate squeezed his hand tighter. She thought about 9-year-old George, who was old enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening, and 7-year-old Charlotte, who adored her great-grandmother's stories about the corgis. 4-year-old Louis would struggle to comprehend why everyone was sad, why the great-grandmother who always made time to play with him would never visit again. "Together," Kate said simply. "We tell them together, and we help them remember all the wonderful times they shared with her." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard small footsteps in the hallway outside their bedroom. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. She looked between her parents with the intuitive awareness that children possess, sensing immediately that something was wrong. "Mommy? Daddy? Why do you look sad?" she asked, climbing onto the bed between them. William wrapped his arms around his daughter, and Kate saw him make a conscious decision to be strong for her, even as his own world was falling apart. This was the burden of his position, to comfort others even when he needed comfort himself. Before he could answer Charlotte's question, George appeared in the doorway, followed by Louis, who was dragging his favorite stuffed animal. The family was together now, and Kate knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they always had. United. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the carpet. Somewhere in London, flags would soon be flying at half-mast, and the formal machinery of succession would begin its ancient choreography. Charles would become king, William would inherit new titles and responsibilities, and the children would move one step closer to their own destinies. But in this moment, they were simply a family dealing with loss, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. Kate watched William gather their children close, and she saw not the future king, but a grandson who had lost someone he loved deeply. She saw a father trying to be strong for his children, a husband who needed her support, now more than ever. The weight of history pressed down on them all, but Kate had learned over the years that sometimes the most important moments happen not in grand ceremonial halls or before crowds of thousands, but in quiet bedrooms at dawn, when a family comes together in love and grief. This was one of those moments, and she knew she would remember it forever. By noon, the world had changed completely. What had begun as a quiet family tragedy in the early morning hours of September 8th had transformed into a global moment of mourning. News channels across the planet were broadcasting the same stark announcement that had first reached William and Kate in the privacy of their bedroom. Queen Elizabeth II was dead. Kate stood at the window of their private sitting room, watching as crowds began to gather outside the palace gates. Even from this distance, she could see people carrying flowers, many of them in tears. The sea of humanity growing on the street below was a testament to the profound connection the Queen had forged with her people over 7 decades of service. William had spent the morning on an endless series of phone calls. As the new heir to the throne, his father Charles was dealing with the immediate constitutional requirements of succession, but William found himself coordinating the family's response to this unprecedented moment. He had spoken with Harry, who was already making arrangements to fly back from California, and with other family members who were struggling with their own grief while trying to fulfill their public duties. The children had taken the news as well as could be expected. George, with the serious demeanor that often made him seem older than his 9 years, had asked thoughtful questions about what would happen next. Charlotte had cried quietly, remembering the last time she had seen her great-grandmother at the Platinum Jubilee celebrations just months earlier. Louis, too young to fully understand the finality of death, kept asking when they would see Gangan again. Kate had found herself stepping naturally into the role of family anchor, the steady presence that everyone could lean on. It was a position she had grown into over the years, learning to balance her own emotions with the needs of those around her. She had ordered the children's favorite lunch, maintained their normal routines as much as possible, and somehow managed to keep her own grief contained enough to help others with theirs. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors to Kensington Palace. Government officials, family members, and close friends all needed to coordinate their responses to the Queen's death. Kate watched William navigate these meetings with remarkable composure, but she could see the exhaustion building behind his eyes. He was running on adrenaline and duty, postponing his own processing of grief until later. Prime Minister Liz Truss arrived for a brief meeting, her own shock at becoming Prime Minister just days before the Queen's death evident in her subdued manner. Kate observed the interaction from across the room, noting how William had already begun to carry himself differently, his posture reflecting the new weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders. The most difficult moment came when they had to make decisions about public appearances. The nation was looking to the royal family for leadership and comfort during this time of mourning, but Kate could see that William was barely holding himself together. She found herself in the unusual position of having to advocate for her husband's emotional needs while also understanding the public's need for reassurance. "The crowds outside are enormous," reported their private secretary during an afternoon briefing. "They're asking to see you, both of you. The press is requesting statements, and there's pressure for a public appearance today." Kate looked at William, seeing the conflict playing out across his face. She knew he understood the importance of showing himself to the grieving public. But she also knew he was struggling with his own raw emotions. This was the impossible balance of royal life, being human while also being symbols, grieving privately while comforting publicly. "Tomorrow," Kate said quietly but firmly. "We'll do a public walkabout tomorrow. Today, we need to be with family." It was a decision that would later be seen as exactly right, but in the moment it required courage to prioritize human needs over public pressure. Kate had learned over the years that sometimes the most important leadership decisions were about knowing when to step back, when to be vulnerable, when to admit that even royals needed time to process impossible losses. The evening brought a different kind of challenge. News reports were beginning to analyze every aspect of the Queen's death and the family's response. Kate found herself watching coverage that included speculation about William's emotional state, comments about how the children were handling the loss, and endless analysis of what this meant for the future of the monarchy. She turned off the television and found William in his study, staring out at the growing memorial of flowers outside their gates. He looked lost, younger somehow than she had seen him in years. The weight of his new position as heir apparent was already changing him, but underneath the emerging statesman, she could still see the little boy who had lost his mother at 12 and now had lost the grandmother who had helped raise him. She would have known exactly what to do, William said without turning around. In every crisis, every difficult moment, she always seemed to know the right thing to say, the right gesture to make. Kate joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. Below them, the crowd had grown even larger as evening approached. People were lighting candles, and the soft glow was beginning to illuminate thousands of faces marked by genuine grief. "You do too," Kate said simply. "You've been leading all day, taking care of everyone, making the decisions that needed to be made. She taught you well." It was true, Kate realized as she said it. Throughout this impossible day, William had demonstrated exactly the kind of steady leadership that his grandmother had modeled for decades. He had put the needs of others before his own emotional processing, had made space for family members to grieve while also managing the complex logistics of a royal death, and had shown the kind of strength that people needed to see from their future king. But he was also a grandson who had lost someone irreplaceable, and Kate could see that the full impact of that loss hadn't hit him yet. The public duties, the family responsibilities, the endless decisions had provided a buffer against the raw reality of grief. She knew that buffer wouldn't last forever, and when it dissolved, he would need her more than ever. As night fell over London, Kate helped coordinate bedtime routines for the children, while William continued to field calls from around the world. Leaders from every continent were offering condolences, and each conversation required emotional energy that William didn't really have to spare. Later, when the palace had finally grown quiet and the children were asleep, Kate found William still at his desk, working through papers that couldn't wait until morning. She didn't say anything, just brought him tea and sat nearby, offering her presence as comfort. Sometimes, she had learned, the best support was simply being there, ready to catch someone when they finally allowed themselves to fall. The morning of September 9th dawned gray and drizzly, as if the weather itself was reflecting the nation's mood. Kate woke before the alarm, having slept fitfully through a night filled with strange dreams about the Queen. Beside her, William was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the distant look she had come to recognize as his way of mentally preparing for difficult public duties. Today would be their first public appearance since the Queen's death. They had decided on a walkabout to see the flowers and tributes that had been accumulating outside Windsor Castle, followed by a brief meeting with some of the staff who had served the Queen for decades. Kate knew it would be emotionally challenging for William, but she also understood that it was necessary for the healing of the nation. "The children want to come," William said quietly as they got dressed. George specifically asked if he could lay flowers for great-grandmother. Kate considered this carefully. She understood George's desire to participate in honoring his great-grandmother's memory, but she also worried about exposing the children to the intense emotion and media scrutiny that would surround any public appearance. Yet there was something appealing about the idea of the family grieving together, publicly and honestly. "Charlotte and Louis too?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the determined look in William's eyes. They all loved her. They should have the chance to say goodbye properly. It was a decision that would resonate far beyond that morning. In choosing to include their children in this moment of public grief, William and Kate were making a statement about the human side of the monarchy, about the importance of family, even in the most formal circumstances. The drive to Windsor was quiet, with the children unusually subdued in the back seat. George held a small bouquet of white roses that he had helped select from their garden at Kensington Palace. Charlotte clutched a handwritten note she had worked on the night before, her careful 7-year-old handwriting spelling out, "Thank you for the stories, Gan." Louis, not fully understanding the solemnity of the occasion, was more interested in pointing out interesting cars they passed along the way. As their car approached Windsor Castle, Kate felt her breath catch. The crowds were enormous, far larger than any of them had anticipated. Thousands of people lined the streets, many holding flowers, banners, and photographs of the Queen. The sound of their arrival was met not with cheers, as would normally greet the royal family, but with a respectful silence that was somehow more powerful than any celebration. William reached for Kate's hand as they prepared to leave the car. She could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that betrayed his nervousness. Despite his composed exterior, this would be his first major public appearance as heir to the throne, and the weight of that new responsibility was evident in every line of his posture. "Together," Kate whispered, the same word she had used the morning before when they told the children about the Queen's death. It had become their private mantra, a reminder that whatever challenges they faced, they would face them as a family. The moment they stepped out of the car, Kate was struck by the atmosphere. There was a hushed reverence in the crowd that she had never experienced before at a royal engagement. These people weren't here as royal watchers or casual observers. They were genuinely mourning, and they were looking to William and Kate for comfort and leadership in their grief. George walked between his parents, his small hand firmly grasped in William's, while Kate held Charlotte and Louis stayed close, to her other side. The sight of the entire family together, clearly grieving but also clearly united, seemed to provide exactly what the crowd needed. People began to call out gentle words of sympathy and support, their voices carrying genuine affection and concern. At the first flower memorial, William knelt down to George's level and helped his son place the white roses among the thousands of other tributes. Kate watched this interaction with tears in her eyes, seeing in it a perfect encapsulation of the Queen's legacy being passed to the next generation. George's serious concentration as he carefully positioned the flowers showed that he understood the significance of the moment even at his young age. Charlotte wanted to read her note aloud, but her voice faltered after the first few words. Kate knelt beside her daughter and quietly suggested they leave the note with the flowers, so that others could read Charlotte's message and know how much a little girl had loved her great-grandmother. It was a gentle way of helping Charlotte participate without overwhelming her, and the crowd around them seemed to appreciate the tenderness of the moment. As they moved through the crowd, Kate found herself in conversations she had never expected to have. An elderly woman with tears streaming down her face grabbed Kate's hand and said, "She was like a mother to all of us. How do we go on without her?" The question was so raw, so honest, that Kate felt her own careful composure begin to crack. "We remember her example," Kate heard herself saying. "We try to live with the same dedication and grace that she showed us every day." It was perhaps the most spontaneous and personal statement Kate had ever made during a public engagement, but it seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, from her own genuine admiration for the Queen's remarkable life of service. The woman squeezed Kate's hand tighter and nodded, as if Kate had given her exactly the guidance she needed. William, meanwhile, was having similar encounters throughout the crowd. Kate watched him speak with a veteran who had served in Northern Ireland, with a woman who had met the Queen during a hospital visit decades earlier, with children who had drawn pictures and wanted to know if the Queen was happy in heaven. Each conversation required emotional energy that William was giving freely, despite his own grief. One moment particularly moved Kate. A young girl, probably about Charlotte's age, approached William with a handmade card and asked if he was sad. that his grandma had died. The simplicity of the question, coming from a child who understood loss in the most basic terms, seemed to break through all of William's royal training. He sat down on the pavement so that he was at the little girl's eye level and told her, honestly, that yes, he was very sad, but that talking to people like her was helping him feel better. The interaction was captured by photographers and would later become one of the most widely shared images from that day. The future King of England sitting on the sidewalk, speaking honestly with a child about grief. It perfectly captured what Kate had always loved about William, his ability to be both royal and human, formal and accessible, strong and vulnerable. As they prepared to leave Windsor after nearly 2 hours of meeting with mourners, Kate realized something profound had happened. What had begun as a duty, a necessary public appearance to acknowledge the nation's grief, had become something much more meaningful. It had been a genuine shared experience of mourning, a moment where the distance between the royal family and the people had dissolved into common human emotion. The children were exhausted but seemed somehow lighter than they had that morning. Participating in honoring their great-grandmother's memory had given them a sense of closure that Kate hadn't expected. George, in particular, seemed proud that he had been able to contribute to the public memorial, that his flowers would be part of the enormous tribute to the Queen's life. On the drive back to Kensington Palace, William was quiet, processing everything they had experienced. Kate could see that the mourning had been both draining and healing for him, that connecting with people who shared his grief had provided comfort he hadn't known he needed. The days that followed blurred together in a mixture of private grief and public ceremony. Kate found herself navigating territory she had never imagined, helping to plan a state funeral, while also trying to maintain some sense of normalcy for their children. The Queen's death had set in motion an ancient protocol that was both magnificent and overwhelming in its complexity. Westminster Hall had become the center of the nation's mourning, with the Queen's coffin lying in state as hundreds of thousands of people waited in a queue that stretched for miles along the Thames. Kate and William made several visits to witness this extraordinary outpouring of public grief, and each time, Kate was moved by the dedication of people who had waited for hours simply to pay their respects. On one particularly emotional visit, they encountered a group of women in their 80s who had traveled from Scotland to London specifically to say goodbye to the Queen. These women had lived through the entire span of Elizabeth's reign, and their stories of how the Queen had been a constant presence through wars, celebrations, and personal tragedies gave Kate a deeper understanding of the profound bond between the monarch and her people. "She was there when I got married in 1953, the same year she was crowned," one of the women told Kate. "She was there when my children were born, when my husband died, when my grandchildren graduated university. She was the constant in all our lives. How do you replace someone like that?" Kate found herself having no easy answer because the truth was that the Queen was irreplaceable. What mattered now was honoring her legacy while finding a way forward that would serve the nation she had loved so deeply. At home, the children were struggling with the enormity of the attention surrounding their great-grandmother's death. George, as the eldest, was most aware of the historical significance of what was happening, but he was also confused by the intensity of media coverage and public interest. Charlotte had nightmares several nights in a row, and Louis became clingy, needing extra reassurance that other important people in his life were not going to disappear. Kate made the decision to bring in a child psychologist who specialized in helping children process grief, not because she thought her children couldn't handle the loss, but because she wanted to give them every tool possible to understand their emotions. The sessions were informal, often conducted over tea and biscuits in their private sitting room, but they provided valuable insights into how each child was processing the death differently. William, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complex emotions while also stepping into his new role as Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. The title came with enormous responsibilities and expectations, and Kate watched him struggle to balance his personal grief with his public duties. There were moments when she worried that he was suppressing his own emotional needs in order to be strong for everyone else. The planning meetings for the funeral were particularly difficult. Every detail had to be perfect, not just as a reflection of the Queen's wishes, but as a final gift to a nation that needed to say goodbye properly. Kate found herself involved in discussions about everything from the music selections to the seating arrangements for world leaders, but always with an awareness that behind all the protocol and tradition, this was ultimately about saying farewell to someone they had all loved deeply. One evening, while reviewing funeral programs late into the night, William finally broke down. The careful composure he had maintained for days suddenly cracked, and Kate found herself holding her husband as he sobbed for the grandmother he would never see again, for the children who would grow up without her gentle guidance, for the nation that had lost its anchor. "I don't know how to do this without her," he whispered into Kate's shoulder. "She was always there, always knew what to do. How do I lead when I feel so lost?" It was the most vulnerable Kate had ever seen her husband, and in that moment, she understood that her role was not just to support him publicly, but to be the safe harbor where he could acknowledge his fears and uncertainties. She held him tighter and reminded him of all the ways he had already shown leadership in the days since the Queen's death. His compassion with the crowds, his strength with the children, his grace under the intense pressure of global scrutiny. The night before the funeral, Kate couldn't sleep. She found herself walking through their apartment, checking on the children, making sure their funeral outfits were properly prepared, and thinking about the magnitude of the day ahead. The entire world would be watching as Britain said goodbye to its longest reigning monarch, and Kate knew that she and William would be central figures in that farewell. She eventually found herself in the nursery, looking at photographs on Louis's dresser that included several pictures of him with the Queen. In one, taken just a few months earlier, the Queen was helping Louis feed the ducks at Balmoral, both of them laughing at something he had said. The joy on both their faces was so genuine, so filled with mutual affection, that Kate found herself crying for the relationship Louis would never fully remember, for all the moments that would now never happen. William found her there, and without saying anything, he wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood together in the quiet of the nursery, both thinking about loss and love and the impossible task of explaining either to children who deserved nothing but happiness and security. She loved them so much, Kate said finally. "She loved all of us," William replied. "And tomorrow we get to show the world who she really was." The morning of the funeral dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crisp September air that seemed appropriate for such a momentous day. Kate dressed carefully in black, adding the Queen's diamond and pearl earrings that had been gifted to her years earlier. The jewelry felt heavier than usual, weighted with memory and significance. The children were unusually quiet as they prepared for the day. George and Charlotte would attend the funeral service, while Louis would stay home with his nanny. Deemed too young for such a long and emotionally intense ceremony, Kate had agonized over this decision, knowing that Louis would later wonder why he hadn't been included, but ultimately deciding that the risk of overwhelming him outweighed the symbolism of having all three children present. As they prepared to leave for Westminster Abbey, Kate took one last look around their apartment. When they returned that evening, the Queen would be buried. The formal mourning period would be drawing to a close, and they would begin the long process of adjusting to life without the woman who had been the center of their family and their nation for so long. William appeared beside her, dressed in his military uniform, looking every inch the future king he had become. But Kate could still see the grieving grandson in his eyes, the little boy who had lost another important woman in his life. She straightened his medals unnecessarily, a small gesture of care that said everything about their partnership. "Ready?" he asked, though they both knew that no one could ever be truly ready for a day like this. "Together," Kate replied. And together, they walked out to face the world and say their final goodbye to the Queen. Westminster Abbey had never felt so vast or so intimate at the same time. As Kate walked down the ancient aisle beside William, with George and Charlotte following behind them, she was acutely aware of the 2,000 people filling every seat, while also feeling as though this was the most private moment of her life. The weight of history pressed down on them all, but so did the weight of personal loss. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard, and topped with the imperial state crown, sat before the altar like a final reminder of a life dedicated entirely to service. Kate had seen the Queen wear that crown on numerous occasions, but seeing it now, motionless and symbolic, drove home the finality of what they were all experiencing. George and Charlotte had been remarkably composed throughout the morning, but Kate could see the strain beginning to show as they took their seats in the front row. Charlotte kept glancing at her parents for reassurance, while George sat with the serious expression he wore when trying to be brave in difficult situations. Kate wished she could gather both children onto her lap, but protocol and the solemnity of the occasion required them to maintain proper posture and dignity. The service began with the familiar words of the hymn, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended," and Kate felt William's hand find hers as thousands of voices joined together in song. It was a moment of unity that transcended grief, connecting everyone present in shared purpose and memory. She could hear Charlotte's small voice singing along, the words slightly uncertain but the intention pure. Archbishop Welby's sermon focused on the Queen's life of service, her unwavering faith, and her dedication to the people of the Commonwealth. But for Kate, the most powerful moments were the smaller, more personal touches woven throughout the ceremony. The hymns the Queen had chosen herself, the readings selected to reflect her deep Christian faith, the presence of her beloved corgis, leads, and her favorite riding crop placed on the coffin. When the Archbishop spoke about the Queen's role as a mother and grandmother, Kate felt William's grief intensify beside her. She knew he was thinking about all the conversations he would never have with his grandmother, all the advice he would now have to navigate without, all the family gatherings that would forever feel incomplete. The burden of his new position, as heir, seemed to settle more heavily on his shoulders with each word spoken about the Queen's extraordinary legacy. During the 2 minutes of silence that concluded the service, Westminster Abbey fell completely quiet except for the sound of muffled sobs from throughout the congregation. Kate closed her eyes and found herself thinking not about the Queen's public accomplishments, remarkable as they were, but about smaller moments. The Queen teaching Charlotte to curtsy properly, her delight when Louis had climbed onto her lap during a family photograph, the way she had always made time for each grandchild individually, despite her overwhelming schedule. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch was both magnificent and heartbreaking. William walked behind the gun carriage carrying his grandmother's coffin, his military bearing impeccable despite the emotional turmoil Kate knew he was experiencing. She rode in a car with Camilla and the children, watching through the windows as millions of people lined the streets of London to pay their final respects. The sight of so many people, all united in grief and respect, was overwhelming. Kate saw elderly veterans saluting as the coffin passed, children throwing flowers, and countless individuals simply standing in respectful silence. This was the Queen's final journey through her capital city, and the outpouring of love was unlike anything Kate had ever witnessed. Charlotte began to cry softly as they passed through crowds that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Kate pulled her daughter closer, whispering gentle reassurances while also fighting back her own tears. George remained stoic, but Kate could see him processing the magnitude of what was happening, understanding perhaps for the first time the true extent of his great-grandmother's impact on the world. At Wellington Arch, the coffin was transferred to a hearse for the journey to Windsor Castle, where the Queen would be buried beside Prince Philip in a private family service. This transition from public ceremony to private farewell felt symbolic of the Queen's entire life, always balancing her public duties with her deep love for her family. The drive to Windsor gave them all a brief respite from the intense scrutiny and protocol of the morning. In the relative privacy of their car, Kate was able to comfort Charlotte more openly and check on George, who was beginning to show signs of exhaustion from maintaining his composure for so long. William joined them for this part of the journey, and Kate could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders as they moved from the public ceremony toward the more intimate family burial. St. George's Chapel at Windsor felt like a sanctuary, after the grandeur of Westminster Abbey. Here, surrounded only by close family members, they could grieve more openly and personally. The Queen had always considered Windsor her true home, and there was something fitting about her final service taking place in the chapel, where she had worshipped regularly and where so many family celebrations and sorrows had been marked over the years. Kate watched William during this final service, seeing him struggle between his public role and his private grief. As the coffin was lowered into the vault below the chapel, she saw tears finally flowing freely down his cheeks. It was a moment of raw humanity that reminded everyone present that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, this was ultimately about a family saying goodbye to someone they loved deeply. The burial service was brief, but deeply moving. The Dean of Windsor spoke about the Queen's faith and her love for her family, while outside the chapel, the bells of Windsor Great Park tolled across the countryside she had loved so much. When the final prayers were said and the Queen was laid to rest beside her beloved Philip, Kate felt a profound sense of an era ending. As they left the chapel, Kate noticed how different William looked. The formal requirements of the day were nearly complete, and she could see him beginning to process what this all meant for their future. He was no longer simply the Duke of Cambridge. He was the Prince of Wales, first in line to the throne, with all the responsibilities and expectations that came with that position. The children were exhausted but seemed to understand that they had participated in something historically significant. George in particular appeared older somehow, as if the day's events had accelerated his understanding of his own future role. Charlotte was quieter than usual, processing emotions too complex for her 7 years, while Kate worried about how to help her daughter make sense of such a profound loss. That evening back at Kensington Palace, Kate found herself alone for the first time in days. William was making final phone calls to family members and foreign dignitaries. The children were asleep, and the palace was finally quiet after weeks of constant activity and planning. She stood once again at the window overlooking the crowds that were still gathered outside their gates. The flowers and tributes had grown into a sea of color and memory that stretched as far as she could see. People were still arriving, even in the evening hours after the funeral, still wanting to be part of this collective goodbye. Kate realized that while this day had marked the end of the Queen's extraordinary life, it had also marked the beginning of a new chapter for her own family. William was now heir to the throne. Their children were next in line after him, and she would need to help guide them all through the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The Queen's example would always be there to inspire them, but they would have to find their own way of serving the nation she had loved so completely. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and Kate was beginning to understand that grief was not something that ended with burial, but something that transformed and became part of daily life. The palace had returned to its normal routines. The crowds outside had diminished to their usual numbers and the world had moved forward. But for William and the children, the absence of the Queen remained a constant presence. William had thrown himself into his new role as Prince of Wales, with characteristic determination, but Kate could see the toll it was taking. Every meeting, every engagement, every decision was filtered through the knowledge that he was now responsible for continuing his grandmother's legacy, while also preparing for his own eventual reign. The weight of expectation was enormous, and Kate found herself becoming even more protective of their family time, knowing that William needed space to process his grief alongside his new responsibilities. The children were adjusting in their own ways. George had begun asking more questions about what it meant to be a future king, his natural curiosity intensified by his growing awareness of how the Queen's death had changed his family's position. Kate and William had decided to answer his questions honestly but age-appropriately, not wanting to burden him with adult concerns, but also respecting his intelligence and his right to understand his own future. Charlotte had started a small ritual of her own, placing fresh flowers from their garden by a photograph of the Queen that sat on the mantel in their private sitting room. She never said much about it, but Kate often found her daughter standing quietly in front of the picture, sometimes talking softly to her great-grandmother about her day at school or a book she was reading. It was Charlotte's way of maintaining connection, and Kate was careful never to interrupt these private moments. Louis, still too young to fully comprehend the permanence of death, occasionally asked when they would see Gone again. Each time broke Kate's heart a little more, but she and William had developed gentle ways of explaining that while they wouldn't see the Queen again, they would always remember her and carry her love with them. The first major test of their new normal came with their first public engagement since the funeral, a visit to a children's hospital that the Queen had patronized for decades. Kate was nervous about how William would handle the emotional demands of public duty while still processing his grief, but she also understood that returning to service was an important part of healing. The visit turned out to be exactly what they all needed. The children and families at the hospital were dealing with their own challenges, and focusing on bringing them joy and comfort reminded William and Kate of the fundamental purpose of their role. When a young patient asked William if he missed his grandmother, his honest answer that he missed her very much but that helping others made him feel closer to her seemed to resonate with everyone present. At home that evening, Kate found William in their private study, looking through photo albums that had belonged to the Queen. The images spanned decades, showing family holidays at Balmoral, official state occasions, and countless informal moments that captured the Queen's personality beyond her public image. "Look at this one," William said, showing Kate a photograph of the Queen with toddler George on her lap, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's view. "I want to make sure the children remember these moments, not just the formal occasions and the history books." It was a sentiment that Kate understood completely. While the Queen's historical significance was undeniable, her role as a loving great-grandmother was equally important to preserve. Kate suggested creating special memory books for each child, combining photographs with written accounts of their personal experiences with the Queen. The project became a family activity over the following weeks. George contributed his memories of fishing lessons at Balmoral and the Queen's stories about the horses. Charlotte wrote about tea-time conversations and the Queen's collection of handbags that always seemed to contain exactly what was needed. Even Louis, with Kate's help, included drawings and simple stories about playing games with his great-grandmother. As they worked on these memory books, Kate noticed something beautiful happening. The acute pain of grief was gradually transforming into something more sustainable, a deep appreciation for the time they had shared with the Queen, and a determination to honor her memory through their own actions. William's confidence in his new role began to grow as well. Initially overwhelmed by the scope of his responsibilities as Prince of Wales, he gradually found his rhythm, combining his grandmother's dedication to duty with his own more modern approach to royal service. Kate watched him develop into the leader she had always known he could be, drawing strength from the Queen's example while also trusting his own instincts. The Queen's influence on their children became more apparent as time passed. George began showing the same serious sense of responsibility that had characterized his great-grandmother, while Charlotte demonstrated the Queen's gift for remembering personal details about the people she met. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to have inherited something of the Queen's natural ability to bring joy to difficult situations. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in October, exactly 1 month after the funeral, the family visited the Queen's grave at Windsor for the first time since the burial. It was a private visit, with no media or public attention, just a family wanting to spend time with someone they missed. They brought flowers from the garden at Kensington Palace, the same varieties that Charlotte had been placing by the Queen's photograph. As they stood together beside the simple stone marker, Kate realized how much they had all changed in the past month. The raw edge of grief had softened into something more manageable, and while they would always miss the Queen deeply, they were learning to carry their love for her forward into their new roles and responsibilities. George asked if he could say something aloud, and William nodded encouragingly. In his clear, serious voice, George promised his great-grandmother that he would try to be as kind and dedicated as she had been, and that he would take care of his family the way she had taken care of hers. It was a moment of profound maturity from a 9-year-old boy, and Kate felt tears running down her cheeks as she listened to her son make this heartfelt commitment. William's own composure wavered, but he managed to tell George how proud the Queen would be of him. As they walked back to their car, Kate reflected on how grief had changed all of them. But perhaps most remarkably, it had brought them closer together as a family. The shared experience of loss had deepened their appreciation for each other and strengthened their commitment to the values the Queen had embodied throughout her remarkable life. The evening light was beginning to fade as they returned to Kensington Palace, but Kate no longer felt the heavy sadness that had characterized the weeks immediately following the Queen's death. In its place was something more complex but ultimately more hopeful. A deep gratitude for the time they had shared with an extraordinary woman, and a quiet confidence that they could honor her memory while also creating their own path forward. That night, after the children were asleep, Kate found William on their private terrace, looking up at the stars. She joined him in comfortable silence, both of them processing the day's emotions. Eventually, William spoke about how visiting the grave had felt different than he expected. Sad, certainly, but also somehow peaceful. "She would want us to be happy," he said finally. "She would want the children to grow up with joy, not just duty. She would want us to remember her with love, not just grief." Kate took his hand and agreed, knowing that they had reached an important turning point in their journey through loss. The Queen's death had ended an era, but it had also begun a new chapter in their lives, one that would be shaped by her example, but written in their own words, lived according to their own hearts, guided by the love she had shown them and the love they continued to share with each other and their children.